The sound of my dad's booming laughter cut through the chatter of our annual family reunion like a knife. I sat in the corner of the backyard, watching him gesture dramatically to our relatives, a beer in one hand and pure condescension in his voice. "And she thinks she's a lawyer," he declared, pointing in my direction without even looking at me. The circle of aunts, uncles, and cousins erupted in knowing chuckles. 8 years of school for what? To shuffle useless paperwork? I gripped my plastic cup tighter, the condensation making my fingers slip. This was nothing new. For the past 3 years since I'd graduated law school, every family gathering ended the same way, with me being the punchline of Dad's favourite joke. "Now, David," Dad continued, his chest puffing with pride as he looked toward my older brother. "David's got a real business, just opened his own firm last month, already pulling in 6 figures. David basked in the attention, straightening his expensive tie and flashing that perfect smile that had charmed everyone since we were kids. "Well, you know, Dad, someone in the family had to make something of themselves." The dig was subtle but sharp. I felt it hit exactly where it was supposed to. But what none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly imagine as they stood there mocking my useless paperwork, was that just 6 hours earlier I had walked out of the federal courthouse with the biggest victory of my career. A case that would change everything, not just for me, but for them too. Little did they know I had won the case that would destroy David's perfect little world. My name is Sarah Chen, and this is the story of how my family's cruelest joke became their worst nightmare. Growing up as the youngest in the Chen family meant growing up in David's shadow. While he was quarterback of the high school football team and student body president, I was the weird kid who spent lunch periods in the library reading legal precedents for fun, while he dated the homecoming queen and got into business school with mediocre grades and Dad's connections. I was grinding through AP classes and debate team, dreaming of one day arguing cases in front of the Supreme Court. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" became Mum's favourite question somewhere around my sophomore year. David was charismatic, popular, and most importantly to my parents, he showed interest in taking over Dad's construction company someday. I was none of those things. The first time I told my parents I wanted to be a lawyer, I was 14. We were sitting around the dinner table, and Dad had just finished telling us about his latest big contract, a shopping mall that would bring in millions. "I want to study law," I announced, cutting through his story about profit margins. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Dad set down his fork slowly. "Law? What do you want to do that for?" "I want to help people, fight for justice, make sure big corporations can't hurt innocent families." David snorted. "Oh God, Sarah, you sound like a Saturday morning cartoon." "Your brother's right," Mum chimed in, her voice gentle but firm. "Law is difficult and expensive. Maybe you should think about something more practical, business like David, or teaching." But Dad's reaction was the worst. He didn't argue or try to convince me otherwise. He just looked at me with this expression of complete disappointment, like I had personally let him down by having dreams that didn't align with his vision of success. "We'll see," he said finally, turning back to his dinner. "You'll change your mind." But I didn't change my mind. Not when they refused to help pay for LSAT prep courses. Not when they skipped my law school graduation because David had an important business meeting the same day. Not when Dad introduced me to his friends as Sarah, she's still in school, even after I'd passed the bar exam. The day I got my first job at Morrison, Crawford & Associates, a small but respected firm specialising in environmental law, I called home excited to share the news. "That's nice, sweetheart," Mum said distractedly. "David just got promoted to regional manager. We're so proud." I hung up, feeling smaller than ever. For 3 years, I worked cases that mattered. I helped families whose wells had been contaminated by industrial runoff. I fought against companies that dumped toxic waste in low-income neighbourhoods. I won some, lost others, but every day I went home knowing I was making a difference. And every family gathering, Dad's jokes got louder and meaner. Last Christmas, he actually brought props. He pulled out a stack of legal documents from his brief work, building permits and contracts, and waved them around. "Look at this," he announced to the room. "Real paperwork that makes real money, not like Sarah's make-believe lawyer games." The room erupted in laughter. Even cousins I barely knew were chuckling. David recorded it on his phone. That night I went home and cried for 2 hours, but I kept working, I kept fighting, and 6 months ago I caught the case that would change everything. The Morrison Industries environmental lawsuit started like so many others that crossed my desk. A small community in upstate New York, residents getting sick, water tasting funny, lawns dying. The kind of case that big firms wouldn't touch because the potential payout wasn't worth the years of litigation it would require. But as I dug deeper into the evidence, I realised this wasn't just another small-town environmental issue. This was massive. Morrison Industries, one of the largest chemical manufacturing companies in the Northeast, had been systematically dumping toxic waste for over 15 years. The contamination affected over 50,000 people across 3 counties, and they had covered it up. The whistleblower who brought me the case was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a former Morrison Industries scientist who had discovered the extent of the contamination and tried to report it internally, only to be fired and threatened with lawsuits if she went public. "They have documents," she told me during our first meeting, sliding a flash drive across the table with shaking hands. "Internal memos, test results, executive emails, everything. They knew people were getting sick, and they buried it." I plugged in the drive that night and didn't sleep for 3 days straight. The evidence was overwhelming, not just environmental damage, but a conspiracy that went all the way to Morrison's board of directors. They had known about the contamination since 2008 and had actively worked to hide it, even going so far as to pay off local officials to delay water quality testing. This was the kind of case that could define a career, the kind of case that could save lives and hold a massive corporation accountable for decades of harm. It was also the kind of case that could destroy anyone who got in Morrison Industries' way. I spent 6 months building an airtight case. I interviewed hundreds of affected residents, compiled medical records, brought in expert witnesses, and slowly, methodically built a wall of evidence so overwhelming that Morrison's army of corporate lawyers couldn't tear it down. Through it all, I told no one in my family what I was working on. Not because I was trying to keep it secret, but because I had learned over the years that my work simply didn't interest them. When I tried to share my victories, they would nod politely and change the subject to David's latest business success. So I worked alone, putting in 18-hour days, surviving on coffee and determination, knowing that this case could either make my career or end it completely. Morrison Industries didn't just have money. They had connections, political connections, media connections, the kind of power that could make a small-town environmental lawyer disappear from the legal landscape permanently. But I had something they didn't expect. I had the truth, and I had nothing left to lose. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Morrison's legal team was everything you'd expect from a billion-dollar corporation. Expensive suits, Ivy League pedigrees, and aggressive tactics designed to intimidate and overwhelm. They tried to discredit Dr. Rodriguez. They questioned my experience. They even attempted to have the case dismissed on technical grounds twice. But the evidence spoke for itself. When the jury returned after only 4 hours of deliberation with a guilty verdict and awarded $847 million in damages to the affected communities, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was 14 years old and first announced my dream of becoming a lawyer. I felt proud. Morrison Industries was found liable for environmental contamination, health damages, and conspiracy to cover up the effects of toxic waste dumping. The judge called it one of the most egregious cases of corporate malfeasance he had seen in 30 years on the bench. But the victory came with a price I hadn't anticipated. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, my phone was already ringing with reporters wanting statements. The Morrison Industries case was front-page news across the Northeast. Environmental groups were calling it a landmark victory. Legal scholars were praising the precedent it set for corporate accountability. And I was getting calls from law firms across the country wanting to hire me, but there was one call I hadn't expected. "Sarah Chen?" The voice was professional, clipped. "This is Jennifer Walsh from Walsh, Morrison and Associates. I represent David Chen's new business venture." My blood went cold. "I think we need to talk," she continued. "Your recent legal victory has created some complications for your brother's firm. Morrison Industries was our largest client." That's when I understood the full scope of what I had just done. David's new firm, the one Dad had been bragging about for months, the one that was supposed to prove he was the successful Chen child, had built its entire business model around representing Morrison Industries' legal needs across their Northeast operations. The company I had just brought down in federal court was the foundation of my brother's 6-figure success. By winning the case that validated my entire career, I had inadvertently destroyed his. And in 3 hours, I would be sitting across from both of them at our annual family reunion, where Dad would once again mock my useless paperwork while bragging about David's business acumen. The irony was so perfect, it almost hurt. I looked at my reflection in the courthouse bathroom mirror. The same woman who had been dismissed, mocked, and marginalized for years had just brought down one of the most powerful corporations in the region. But as I drove toward the reunion, I realized something that made my stomach clench with anxiety. They still didn't know. None of them had any idea what I had accomplished that day. They probably hadn't even seen the news coverage. They never paid attention to environmental law stories. They were going to spend the evening making jokes about my worthless career, completely oblivious to the fact that their golden boy's future was crumbling because of my success. Part of me wanted to call ahead, to give them a heads up about what was coming, but a larger part, the part that had endured years of humiliation and dismissal, wanted to see their faces when they realized what their family disappointment had actually achieved. As I pulled into my parents' driveway, I could already hear David's loud laughter carrying from the backyard. He was probably holding court, telling stories about his brilliant business strategies and his promising future. I sat in my car for a moment, looking at the warm light spilling from the windows, listening to the familiar sounds of my family's voices mixing together in conversation that, as usual, didn't include me. In a few minutes, I would walk through that gate and take my usual place in the corner, listening to the familiar rhythm of Dad's jokes and David's boasting. But this time, I had something they didn't know about. This time, I had won. I walked through the back gate into the familiar chaos of our family reunion. The same folding tables, the same mismatched lawn chairs, the same smell of Dad's overly ambitious barbecue filling the air. Cousins I saw once a year were clustered around the patio. Aunts were fussing over potato salad, and David was exactly where I expected him to be. Centre stage, commanding everyone's attention. The key to success in business, he was saying, gesturing with a beer bottle, is knowing how to identify the right partnerships early. My firm locked in our anchor client before we even signed the lease on our office space. Uncle Mike nodded appreciatively. Smart move. What kind of client? Morrison Industries, David said, and I nearly choked on my own breath. Massive chemical manufacturing company. They needed a dedicated legal team for their Northeast operations, and we positioned ourselves perfectly. It's a 7-figure contract. The circle of relatives made impressed sounds. Dad beamed, like David had just announced he'd won the Nobel Prize. That's my boy, Dad said, clapping David on the shoulder. Now that's what I call real success, real business, not like... His eyes found me standing by the gate, still holding my purse, still processing what I just heard. Sarah, Mum called out with forced cheerfulness. We weren't sure you'd make it. How's the legal work going? The way she said legal work made it sound like I sold magazine subscriptions door to door. It's going well, actually, I said, walking closer to the group. My phone was buzzing insistently in my purse, but I ignored it. Dad grinned, and I knew what was coming before he opened his mouth. Well, everyone, my daughter the lawyer is here, he announced to the whole backyard. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Sarah, tell everyone about your exciting career shuffling paperwork. The laughter started immediately. Not cruel laughter, exactly, but the kind of indulgent chuckling you'd give to a child who insisted they were going to be a dinosaur when they grew up. Dad, I don't shuffle paperwork. I argue cases in federal court. Federal court, David repeated, like I'd claimed to be an astronaut. Hear that, everyone? Federal court? What's your biggest case, Sarah? Someone fight a parking ticket? More laughter. Even cousin Jenny, who I'd always thought was on my side, was smirking behind her wine glass. My phone buzzed again. Then again. Actually, I said, reaching into my purse, I just finished a pretty significant case today. Oh, here we go, Dad said, rolling his eyes theatrically. Let me guess. You saved a family of squirrels from an evil tree removal company? The whole group erupted. David was laughing so hard he was wiping tears from his eyes. Environmental law? He managed between chuckles. God, Sarah, you couldn't pick a more pointless specialty if you tried. My phone was now buzzing continuously. I pulled it out and saw 17 missed calls from reporters, 3 from environmental groups and 1 from the senior partner at my firm. David, I said quietly, what did you just say about Morrison Industries? I said, they're our anchor client, he replied, still grinning. Why? You want to apply for a secretary position? I might be able to put in a good word. The group laughed again, but I wasn't hearing it anymore. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears as I realized the full magnitude of what was about to happen. "They're your biggest client?" I asked. "Biggest and best," Dad interjected proudly. "David's firm is handling all their legal work for the region. Contracts, compliance, the works. It's what real lawyers do, sweetheart." I looked at David's confident face, at Dad's proud expression, at the circle of relatives hanging on every word about the successful Chen child and his brilliant business strategy. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Channel 7 News. I answered it. "Sarah Chen?" The voice was urgent, excited. "This is Tom Morrison from Channel 7. We're running a special report on the Morrison Industries verdict tonight. As the lead attorney who brought them down, would you be available for an on-camera interview? This is the biggest environmental case in the state's history." The backyard had gone completely silent. Every single person was staring at me. "The Morrison Industries verdict?" I repeated slowly, making sure everyone could hear. "You mean the $847 million judgment against Morrison Industries for environmental contamination and conspiracy?" "That's right," the reporter continued, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "Your victory today is already being called a landmark case. Environmental groups are calling you a hero. When can we schedule the interview?" I looked directly at David. His face had gone completely white. "I'll need to call you back," I said into the phone. "I'm at a family gathering." I hung up. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Uncle Mike cleared his throat. "Sarah, did that reporter just say you won an $847 million case against Morrison Industries?" "Today," I confirmed. "Federal court, 3 weeks of trial, guilty verdict on all counts." David's beer bottle slipped from his hand and shattered on the patio. "That's impossible," he whispered. Dad was staring at me like I'd just grown a second head. "Sarah, what exactly did you do?" "I represented 50,000 residents across 3 counties in an environmental contamination lawsuit," I said, my voice steady and professional. Morrison Industries had been illegally dumping toxic waste for 15 years and covering it up. The jury found them liable for environmental damage, health complications, and conspiracy. The judgment was $847 million plus punitive damages. "Punitive damages?" Dad repeated weakly. "Another $200 million, I confirmed. David made a sound like he was choking. "Morrison Industries," he said, his voice cracking. "You sued Morrison Industries." "I didn't just sue them," I said. "I destroyed them." "The company is facing federal criminal charges now. The EPA is taking over their operations. And any law firm that was representing them..." I let the sentence hang in the air. David sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." "David?" Mum asked, confusion clear in her voice. "What's wrong?" "Morrison Industries was our only major client," David said, his voice barely audible. They were everything. Our entire business model. All our contracts, the office lease, the equipment, the staff salaries. The understanding dawned on everyone's faces at the same time. "Your sister just put you out of business," Aunt Linda said, and immediately clapped her hand over her mouth like she couldn't believe she'd said it out loud. Dad turned to look at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not disappointment or condescension, but something like fear. "Sarah," he said carefully, "please tell me you're joking." My phone rang again. This time it was the Washington Post. I answered it on speaker. "Ms. Chen, this is Rebecca Martinez from the Washington Post." We're running a front page story tomorrow about your victory against Morrison Industries. Legal experts are calling it the most significant environmental law decision in decades. How does it feel to have brought down one of the most powerful chemical companies in the Northeast? Every eye in the backyard was on me. It feels like justice, I said clearly. Morrison Industries poisoned entire communities for profit. They knew people were getting sick and they covered it up. Today they were held accountable. And what's next for you? I understand major firms across the country are trying to recruit you. I haven't decided yet, I said, but I'll continue fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. I hung up and looked around the circle of relatives. No one was laughing anymore. David had his head in his hands. Dad was staring at me like he'd never seen me before in his life. So, I said into the silence, I guess my law degree wasn't such useless paperwork after all. The next few minutes were chaos. David was on his phone, frantically calling his business partners. Dad was pacing back and forth, muttering about implications and financial disaster. Mum was trying to get someone to explain to her exactly what had happened, but the most telling reaction came from the extended family. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to me. Sarah, I had no idea you were working on such important cases. We always knew you were smart, but this is incredible. You're going to be famous, a real hero. The same people who had been laughing at Dad's jokes 5 minutes earlier were now crowding around me, asking about my career, my cases, my plans for the future. Uncle Mike wanted to know if I could help with his neighbour's property dispute. Cousin Jenny was asking if I'd be interested in speaking at her book club. It was like watching people flip a switch. But Dad wasn't joining the Sudden Sarah Appreciation Society. He was standing off to the side, watching David make increasingly desperate phone calls, his face getting redder by the minute. Finally, he walked over to me. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Privately." We walked to the far end of the yard, away from the excited chatter of relatives who were now treating me like a celebrity. "Do you understand what you've done?" Dad asked. "I won the biggest environmental case in state history," I replied. "I held a corrupt corporation accountable for poisoning thousands of people. I did my job." "You destroyed your brother's business." "No," I said firmly. "Morrison Industries destroyed David's business when they decided to commit environmental crimes for 15 years. I just exposed the truth." Dad stared at me for a long moment. "He's your brother, Sarah. And for 28 years I've been his sister," I replied. "But that never mattered when you were making jokes about my worthless career, did it?" That was just... we were just having fun. Family teasing. "Family teasing," I repeated. "Dad, you've spent 3 years publicly humiliating me at every family gathering. You've dismissed my education, mocked my career choice, and made me feel like a failure for choosing to help people instead of chasing money." "We didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," I interrupted. "You meant every word. Because to you, success only counts if it comes with a big bank account and social status. The fact that I've been fighting for justice, helping families, making a real difference in people's lives, none of that mattered to you because it wasn't making me rich." Dad opened his mouth to argue, but I wasn't finished. "Do you know what I've accomplished in the last 3 years while you were making your jokes? I've won settlements that got clean water systems installed in 4 different communities. I've held 3 major corporations accountable for environmental damage. I've helped families get medical treatment for illnesses caused by corporate negligence. I've made a difference in hundreds of people's lives. But David built his business on representing a company that was poisoning children, I said. Maybe, instead of worrying about his financial problems, you should be asking why he never bothered to investigate what kind of client he was working for. Dad looked like I'd slapped him. You can't be serious, he said. I'm completely serious. Morrison Industries has been systematically contaminating water supplies across 3 counties. They've caused cancer clusters in 5 different communities. Children have been hospitalized because of their illegal waste dumping. And David's firm was helping them navigate the legal system to avoid consequences. David didn't know that's exactly the problem, I said. He didn't know because he didn't care to know. He saw a big contract and dollar signs, and that was enough. We stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the reunion continuing behind us. I could hear David's voice getting more agitated as he talked to what was probably his 3rd business partner in 10 minutes. What happens now? Dad asked finally. Now? Now, Morrison Industries faces federal criminal charges. The communities they poisoned get the money they need for medical treatment and environmental cleanup. And David learns that there are consequences for building a business on corporate corruption. And us, the family? I looked at him for a long moment. That depends, I said. Are you going to keep treating me like the family disappointment? Are you going to keep making jokes about my useless paperwork? Are you going to keep acting like my career doesn't matter because it doesn't make as much money as David's? Dad didn't answer immediately. Because if you are, I continued, then nothing changes. You'll keep seeing me as a failure, and I'll keep proving you wrong in ways you can't ignore. Sarah, you have to understand. No, I said, I don't have to understand anything. For 28 years, I've tried to understand why nothing I accomplished was ever good enough for this family. I've tried to understand why choosing justice over profit made me a disappointment. I've tried to understand why I was always the punchline of your jokes. My voice was getting stronger, more confident. But today I realized something. I don't need your understanding. I don't need your approval. I don't need you to validate my choices or my career or my life. Dad's face was cycling through emotions I'd never seen from him before. Shock, confusion, something that might have been shame. What I need, I continued, is for you to decide what kind of family you want to be. One that supports each other's dreams and accomplishments, or one that only values success when it comes with a certain price tag. Before he could respond, David appeared beside us, his face pale, and his phone clutched in his shaking hand. Sarah, he said, his voice barely controlled, you have to help me. I looked at my brother, the golden child, the successful one, the son who could do no wrong. And for the first time in my life, he was looking at me like I had something he needed. Help you how? I asked. The firm is finished, he said. Morrison Industries was 90% of our revenue. Without them, we can't make payroll, can't pay the office rent, can't pay back the startup loans. We're going to lose everything. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. You're sorry? David's voice cracked. Sarah, you destroyed my business. You have to do something. Like what? I don't know. Appeal the verdict. Find some technicality. Something. I stared at my brother in disbelief. You want me to help you appeal a case where I proved that your client was poisoning children? It's not about that, David said desperately. It's about family. It's about helping your brother. Family? I repeated. David, where was family when you recorded Dad making jokes about my career and posted it on social media? Where was family when you told your friends I was playing make-believe lawyer games? Where was family when you didn't even bother to show up to my law school graduation? David looked stunned. That was different, he said weakly. No, I said. That was exactly the same. You only care about family when you need something. I looked at both of them, my father and my brother, the two men who had shaped my understanding of success and failure, of worth and disappointment. I spent years trying to earn your respect, I said. I thought if I just worked hard enough, won enough cases, made enough of a difference, you'd finally see that I wasn't a failure. You'd finally be proud of me. Dad started to say something, but I held up my hand. But today I realized something important. I don't need your pride. I don't need your respect. I have the respect of my colleagues, my clients, and the communities I've helped. I have job offers from some of the most prestigious firms in the country. I have the knowledge that I've made a real difference in people's lives. I turned to walk back toward the house. Sarah, wait, Dad called out. I turned back. We are proud of you, he said, and for the first time his voice sounded sincere. We didn't understand what you were doing. You didn't realize it mattered, I finished. Because it didn't make money, he didn't deny it. What happens now? David asked, his voice small. I looked at my brother, this man who had been the golden standard of success my entire life, now broken and desperate because his shortcuts had finally caught up with him. Now you learn the same lesson I learned, I said. That real success isn't about money or status or impressing people at family reunions. It's about building something sustainable, something honest, something you can be proud of when you look in the mirror. But your business was built on representing criminals, I said bluntly. Maybe it's time to build a new one representing people who actually deserve legal protection. I walked back toward the reunion, leaving them standing in the gathering darkness. The party was still going on, but everything had changed. People were looking at me differently now, not with pity or condescension, but with genuine respect. Conversations stopped when I approached, not because I was the family joke, but because I was someone worth listening to. But I found myself not particularly interested in their newfound attention. I had spent so many years craving their approval that I hadn't realized when I'd stopped needing it. My phone buzzed with another interview request, then another. By the time I got to my car, I had messages from CNN, 60 Minutes, and 3 different book publishers. The little girl who had been laughed at for wanting to fight for justice had just become one of the most sought-after environmental lawyers in the country. And the family that had mocked her dreams was finally beginning to understand what they had underestimated for so long. As I drove away from the reunion, I could see Dad and David still standing in the backyard, probably trying to figure out how to salvage what was left of their perfect success story. But I wasn't thinking about them anymore. I was thinking about the 50,000 people who would have clean water because of today's verdict. I was thinking about the communities that would finally get the medical care they needed. I was thinking about the precedent this case would set for holding corporations accountable for environmental crimes. For the first time in my life, I was thinking about my own success on my own terms, and it felt better than any family approval ever could.